There's no evidence that trans athletes have an advantage over anyone else. And there has just been an obsession on trans people's bodies, and particularly on trans women's bodies.
Another activist from the Wi-Fi password movement just went on live TV and gave us all a bad name. We're going to break this down and so much more on today's episode of the Brad vs. Everyone podcast, my daily show where I take on the craziest ideas from across our politics, our media, and the internet, all from an independent perspective. Up first, we've got to talk a little bit more about the fallout from President Trump's executive order attempting to restrict women's sports nationwide and in institutions bound by Title IX, the federal law, to exclude trans women who are born biologically male. As you can imagine, and as we already covered on the show, this is not being received well by the alphabet people, by the extreme LGBTQ activists, and one of them went on CNN for one of the strangest and just most detached from reality segments I've seen on cable news in some time, and that's saying something. Meet Chris Mosier, a trans man and athlete who's become an activist against policies like President Trump's executive order that restrict female sports for females. He went on CNN and had some things to say. Let's take a listen to the first clip here.
So when you hear people say, this is how it should be, trans athletes have a competitive advantage over non-trans athletes, what do you say to them?
There's no evidence that trans athletes have an advantage over anyone else in sports. Trans athletes play sports for the same reasons as anybody else, for our love of the game, to be a part of a team, to challenge ourselves, and most of all, for the youth level, to have fun. And every young person deserves that opportunity to be their authentic self and to play the sports that they love without compromising any part of who they are.
So this right here is everything that's wrong with modern trans and LGBT activism. Live your life how you want. You know what? Knock yourself out, call yourself what you like, dress how you will, present differently. I do not care. And I think most Americans generally are tolerant and open-minded, but don't gaslight us. Don't deny science. Don't deny basic biology and tell us with a straight face that there's no evidence that trans women, that's what this segment is about, have an advantage in sports. It's common sense in basic biology, first and foremost. They are born biologically male. Most of them have gone through male puberty, and they retain some advantages even after going on hormones and all that, which reduces it but doesn't eliminate it. And we all know that. They're taller, they have greater wingspans, their bone density is different, their hearts are bigger. So many things are different between males and females, and transition doesn't totally change that. And for you to get up on TV and say with your whole chest, there's no differences, nothing to see here, is absurd. We all know it's not true, and it just feels insulting to our intelligence, and people naturally recoil at this kind of insult to their intelligence. And the rest of it, you know, trans people play sports for the same reason as everyone else, is just kind of irrelevant because nobody doubted that. Nobody said, or at least most of us aren't saying that trans people are evil and want to play in sports just to harm anyone. Like, no, maybe they just want to win, they want to compete, they want to have fun, and that's fine, and they should be allowed to compete in their own leagues, their own divisions, or in the division associated with their biological sex. But it's just most of that answer is a non sequitur. And then the main part of it is just an insane gaslighting statement. And guys, there's plenty of research showing that the advantages are partially retained by trans athletes, trans women. Even after they transition, they still retain some benefits from male puberty. I'll link to a couple studies below. Now, there are studies on the opposite side suggesting that the advantage does go away. Those studies tend to be pretty flawed. I debunked one of them on my channel a while back because it was total junk science. But this guy, Chris Mosier, could try to make that argument. He doesn't even try. He just denies reality. And that's the kind of thing that is really rubbing people the wrong way, that the LGBT movement, because it's kind of just kowtowed to these radical trans activists, has basically started telling people biology isn't real, and the things we all know about sex and as a material fact of life aren't true. People aren't going to buy that. They're not going to fall for that. And the CNN hosts did not really sufficiently push back on this pseudoscience. Here's a second clip from the interview.
I'm curious about that, Chris, because you say that there's no evidence that there's a competitive advantage, but we've heard from parents who've had a different experience. They've argued that there is irrefutable evidence, irrefutable differences in physiology between the sexes, that hormone therapies don't sufficiently level the playing field. Do you get where they're coming from?
We know that each body is different, every person is different, and that even amongst cisgender kids, that are kids that are not transgender, there are differences in their strength, their speed, their ability, their natural ability, as well as differences in their access to good coaching, to great equipment, to things like rest and recovery or proper nutrition, all of the things that go into making someone be a good athlete. And I think that people don't really consider those other factors. The laser focus has been on hormone therapy or testosterone. And when we're talking about young kids, which is part of what this executive order will be applying to, I think we really miss the mark when we're focusing so heavily on biology and not on the lived experience of kids who are just trying to have the educational experience as their peers.
Oh? I mean, he kind of says the quiet part out loud when he tells people not to focus on the biology and to focus on the lived experience of the trans athletes or whatever. No, actually, the question is about safety and fairness. And so what matters there is the biology and the facts, not people's feelings. And there's this very annoying thing that they often do when they push this side of the argument, which is to essentially suggest that, well, you know, trans athletes may have some advantage, but sports are unequal in lots of ways. There's lots of differences. Okay, then why are boys and girls sports separated? Why not just have one team? Let everyone try out and then cut the worst people and just put the best people on the team. Because in most sports, for most people, and we're generalizing here, there's exceptions to every rule, boys would have a huge advantage and girls would have very minimal access to sports and competition and opportunities. That's why sports exist in sex-distinct categories, because yes, there are variations within each sex, but there are huge differences between the two sexes. And there are even some things out there where females seem to have an advantage in some sense on certain things. But for most sports, the kind of upper body strength and other things associated with the male sex just kind of create a huge gulf that requires these two distinct categories. But I even had this as in my own experience in a gender studies class that I took in college. Yes, I subjected myself to that on purpose. I was curious. And you know what, to their credit, the professor I had, who did identify as trans, of course, was fairly open-minded and did encourage discussion. Of course, it was me versus the entire classroom, but that was kind of typical of my college experience. But anyway, the professor actually suggested at one point that when I pointed out, you know, there's biological differences between athletes, and that's kind of why male and female are separate categories, because men are stronger and faster than women on average. The professor argued that we actually don't know if that's true. That could just be because of the social distinction in the resources and prioritization of sports, that boys' sports are given more emphasis and attention and resources at a young age, and that may be true. But babe, the biology is still a thing. There's a reason that you look at the elite level female athletes in track and field who have access to the best training and diet and everything in the world, and you compare them to the men, and there's a difference. It's not just society doesn't prioritize women's sports as much, which, to be clear, that may be true. That might be a piece of it, but biology is a huge thing. And ultimately, what these people run up against is not bigotry, is not hate, although there's some of that out there. It's biology and facts, and they would have such a better case for the trans movement, for trans acceptance, and for the LGBT community more broadly if they didn't so openly and so brazenly deny reality and deny science, and cast aspersions at those of us who dare disagree with their anti-science ramblings. Take a listen to this final clip.
The executive order specifically targets trans women who want to participate in women's sports. Why do you think trans men are not included in this conversation, and what do you think about that?
There has just been an obsession on trans people's bodies, and particularly on trans women's bodies. And that's really evident here. You know, I think part of the reason from my own experience of being a trans man participating in men's sports, and the difference between myself and any trans woman who just wants to play, is that trans men don't fit this narrative that the Republicans are setting up. They don't fit the narrative that anyone assigned female at birth will be a worse athlete, that people assigned male at birth are bigger, faster, stronger, and better athletes. And we know that that's not true. Not every person assigned male at birth is a good athlete. And when we do have trans men who are able to participate in the men's category, we're largely ignored. And so I think that the issue here is really that laser focus, and it goes to a bigger picture of not just impacting sports, but really impacting and thinking about trying to legislate away the trans community. And sports has just been the entry point to other areas of discrimination against our community.
Chris, babe, as my mug says, your Delulu is showing. Now available at the merch store, linked in the description. In all seriousness, oh boy, this clip made me roll my eyes because this trans activist, Chris, basically suggested that when asked a fair question by the CNN host, which is like, well, why do you think the order only targets trans women and not trans men? Why do people only cared one direction? Chris says, well, they're just obsessed with trans women's bodies and they just ignore trans men like us. Babe, it's because no one cares about that. No one cares if you, as a person born biologically female, want to put yourself at a disadvantage and compete with the males. Knock yourself out. Most people have no problem with that. The reason they focus on trans women is because they're the ones with the potential advantage or safety concerns. That's why. It has nothing to do with obsessing with people's bodies or this kind of creepy aspersion of like sexual prurient interest that he seems to be suggesting we must have in order to have concerns about this. That's actually not it at all, my dude. And if you really think that, you haven't engaged honestly with criticisms or different ideas to any significant extent. And that seems to be the case because I actually reached out to Chris and emailed him and asked him to come on this channel and discuss this issue and told him, you know, I'll be respectful of you. I'll let you air your piece. I just want to exchange ideas. And he just replied to me with no words via email with a screenshot of a tweet where I explained why I don't support trans women and women's sports. And I replied and I'm like, yeah, I don't have the same view as you. That's why I want you to come on the channel, to offer a different view, to have a dialogue. Is that not something you do? You only go into safe spaces like CNN where they're not really going to push back. And that's the problem I had with the CNN segment is the pushback wasn't very solid. It was framed as, well, like parents might have concerns, not like hard science and studies contradict what you're saying. Here's pushback. And also, why isn't there an alternative perspective provided? Why isn't there a guest to show the other side of the argument? That's the criticism I had. I have no problem with them having an extreme activist on who advocates for a position, but there should be pushback and an alternative view if you're going to do balanced news. Anyway, though, Chris didn't respond and isn't going to be coming on the channel anytime soon. And frankly, I think that's because these activists know that their ideas can't withhold serious scrutiny, and that's why they stick to their safe spaces. Now, the final point that Chris made, talking about how the sports issue has just been an entry point to broader pushback and attacks on trans rights, sort of has a grain of truth to it, but kind of in the opposite direction of what Chris thinks. To me, it's more so that the LGBT activists and the alphabet people denied reality and biology and basic fairness so hard on this issue that, as my friend Brianna Wu, a moderate trans woman, has explained, should have been a pretty easy compromise to make, a pretty easy concession to make, to say, listen, we want acceptance, we want rights, but we're not crazy, we're not trying to harm anyone. So yeah, women's sports, the trans movement will agree, need to be restricted to females. But they were even unwilling to do that, a position 80% of the country supports, that's just common sense, that's just basic science and safety and fairness. And so a lot of people were like, whoa, these activists can't be trusted at all. We've got to disagree with everything they've got to say. And that's led to the broader decline in support for rights and acceptance. So Chris is sort of not wrong about that, but it didn't hit the way he thought it hit. What do you guys think about this CNN interview and about Chris Mosier more broadly? Are you convinced by these very strong, very compelling arguments? Let me know in the comments, and do hit that like button while you're at it, and make sure you're subscribed if you aren't yet. Donating to charity can feel really overwhelming. Who do I donate to? What impact is my money having? That's where Bono comes in. It's an amazing new easy, smart, and transparent digital service that helps you donate with no service fee to the causes you care about and gives you impact updates in a social media style feed. You just choose a cause to help solve, set up a monthly donation plan starting from $5, and that's it. Plus, all your donations are in one easily manageable location. Decide when you want to donate more or less, and all your tax-deductible receipts are available in one place no matter how many charities you're giving to. So click the link in the description or use the QR code on screen plus my promo code BRAD to receive $5 towards your first donation with Bono, but only for the first 50 people that go ahead and take advantage of it. So check out Bono today. You'll be glad you did. Up next, we're going to talk about some of the controversies associated with the Super Bowl. I am not a big football guy, but I did tune in for the big game last night, partly to watch the commercials and the halftime show and see all the hubbub because the actual game didn't end up being all that competitive or interesting. And one of those commercials did annoy me, and I went and found the full thing online, and we're going to discuss it. The NFL decided to promote the idea of girls flag football becoming a varsity sport nationwide in all 50 states. And I actually really have nothing against that idea. I think it's interesting. I just don't care that strongly about it one way or the other. If girls want to do it, power to you. If they don't, okay. But I have nothing against the idea, but the way they chose to go about it kind of pissed me off. And I think you'll understand why when you listen to this full ad. Take a listen.
School, son, school! Jaworski, you're on thin ice, mister!
Hey, Principal P.
Stop kicking your principal. Everybody's on thin ice.
What's this? A Dorkosaurus Rex?
Come on, Chad. I don't want any trouble.
Leave him alone. I'll kick your butt, Chad.
Hey, Chad. Check out the new girl.
Ew, what is she wearing?
Girls don't play football.
They do where I'm from.
Get a load of this one. Think fast!
You think fast. Right in the Jimmy Johnson.
This ain't over.
We just getting started, Chad.
Get the clap!
Let's go, let's go! Get down, get down. Come on, where is it? There you go. Yeah.
Ooh, little girl bad.
Oh!
Enough! Let's settle this once and for all. Your best guy?
Girl.
Whatever. Versus our best guy. The Brad.
Oh, not the Brad. I'm Brad.
I can read.
There you go. You got folded up, Brad.
Get her!
Okay. That's what I'm talking about. Oh.
So I actually like the end of the ad where they show girls competing against other girls. They make it seem really cool, look exciting and fun, and are like, oh, let's make this a thing. I have no issue with that. If people want to do that, great. I would maybe be interested in it a little bit, but it's not really for me or about me. Probably not really my cup of tea, but that's fine. Like, whatever, cool. What annoyed me about this is the way they had to make it like a kind of woke girl boss thing where men are crude and trash and like obnoxious and caricature them, which is just so like 2020 and doesn't really seem like the way to convince men and boys that they should support having this new thing. And then the kind of pseudo-scientific part of it, like having this girl dodge and flip in the air around like 10 male football players. It's like, obviously it's a commercial, so not everything has to be super realistic, but women aren't better than men at football. That's not a thing. And not everything about promoting women and girls has to be in opposition to men. It doesn't have to be about showing up men. We can do anything they can do in even better because they can't. And vice versa, there are lots of things women can do better than men or that men can't do at all. And that's all fine. Equal doesn't mean exactly the same in all ways. So that was the kind of issue I had with it. Like, why does it have to be promoted so oppositionally to men and boys? And also, if that's true, why are they promoting that girls play flag football in all 50 states instead of just football? Like, they're simultaneously trying to deny there's any difference and that girls can be even better than boys at this, but then also advocating for something incredibly different, implicitly acknowledging that distinction and difference. It just doesn't make sense to me. It felt like a unneeded error and made me, like, and I imagine many other people, feel resistant to something we otherwise wouldn't have been resistant towards. I saw these interesting tweets about this from a woman I follow on Twitter named Allie. As a woman, this should embarrass you. It's like adults letting a little kid win at a game so they feel good. Women's lives don't need to be lived in opposition to men. I'd love to see more women's sports, but not if we need imaginary enemies to beat. She continued, there are so many more arguments for women's sports than we can beat the stupid boys, right, ladies? Flag football is great, but now you've turned its image into something women do to prove themselves against men who never signed up to be the villain. So yeah, I mean, I wasn't horrified by this ad, I wasn't triggered by it, but it did rub me the wrong way, and it rubbed some other people the wrong way as well, which is why it's going viral right now in the aftermath of the Super Bowl. What did you think? Do you like the idea of flag football as a girls' sport in high school? And do you think the ad did an effective job at conveying support for this idea? Let me know in the comments. But speaking of things that are going viral after the Super Bowl, we're going to talk briefly about the right-wing online response to the halftime show performed by Kendrick Lamar. First, I'll say that, I like Kendrick Lamar, some of his songs. I didn't think the performance was amazing in terms of the music, the vocals. It was hard to make out the words. He's not he's not singing or anything super impressive in that front, though I did think the performance was amazing in terms of the actual performance, the dancing, the coordinated movements, the displays, the colors, all of that I thought were really remarkable, but I wasn't wowed by the musical performance, to say the least. That said, some of the whining online from right-wing Twitter commentators and political commentators made me roll my eyes so hard I think I gave myself a little bit of a headache. For example, MAGA influencer Benny Johnson tweeted, "Hey NFL, Trump won. We are no longer letting talentless, mumbling, pagan, satanic cultists do halftime shows and pretend like people like it. Thanks, everyone." Dude, give me a break. You don't have to be into rap music. I'm not crazy about it. I dabble a little bit, but to call Kendrick Lamar, who's basically a poet and is an amazing lyricist, talentless is absurd. And to call that halftime show pagan or satanic or anything like that is completely unhinged and hysterical. If anything, it wasn't even particularly explicit or inappropriate compared to a lot of the halftime shows we've had in the past. You'd think conservatives would be glad there was way less sexual innuendo and provocative dancing or whatever, but they're still found a way to be mad about it. I mean, Kendrick Lamar is the only rapper to win a Pulitzer Prize for his lyric writing and his storytelling. You don't have to like his music, his message. You don't have to be into rap music generally. It's okay if it's not your thing. It's okay if you didn't like the halftime show. But to call this guy talentless is ridiculous. And the clutching of the pearls and calling stuff satanic and all that is just peak boomer conservatism. No offense to the boomers out there who are chill. Meanwhile, Jack Posobiec, the massive far-right influencer, tweeted, "DEI halftime show." Bruh. I hate this so much because I'm one of the people who's been criticizing and pushing back on DEI and a lot of these policies that are unfair and discriminatory and counterproductive in their own right. And the left-wing response is that, oh, well, when Republicans and conservatives say DEI, they just mean the N-word or they just hate black people or anything like that. And that's so not true for most of us making good faith criticisms. And you have people like this who it literally does seem just see a black person and start yelling DEI now. That is racist and that is irresponsible and reckless and callous. They did not put Kendrick Lamar on stage because he is black or because of his identity. They did it because he's an incredibly popular, successful, and award-winning rapper and lyricist. And maybe you think the performance was bad. That's fine. You're totally free to say that. But online conservatives have got to stop throwing around DEI like candy on Halloween. They're doing the same thing that the left did, where they called everything racist under the sun all the time. They're turning that into a caricature and draining it of its power and its usefulness, and actually playing into the hands of critics who want to dismiss the backlash or the criticism altogether with these kinds of out-of-touch tweets and takes. Next up, we're going to briefly touch on Trump's Super Bowl interview that he gave, which ended up being kind of spicy in a couple parts, especially this one moment where he confirmed that he apparently really is serious about the idea of Canada as the 51st state. Take a look at this clip from Trump's interview with Fox News' Bret Baier.
The Prime Minister said this weekend to a group of Canadian businessmen, he was at a private meeting, he said that your wish for Canada to be the 51st state is a, quote, real thing. Is it a real thing?
Yeah, it is. I think Canada would be much better off being a 51st state because we lose $200 billion a year with Canada, and I'm not going to let that happen. It's too much. Why are we paying $200 billion a year, essentially in subsidy to Canada? Now, if they're a 51st state, I don't mind doing it.
So there's a lot to unpack there. But before we get to the bit about trade and economics, I just think this idea of Canada as the 51st state is a really bad one, and I don't understand why Trump supports it. Like, he does know that if Canada became a state, or honestly more likely multiple states because it's so big and has different provinces, but even if it was just one state, they would get to send 2 Democratic senators who would make AOC look like a Republican in their political views, and they would get to send dozens of members of Congress relative to population, and other states would lose representation, and you would skew our country far to the left politically by adding Canada. Does Trump think that would go well for him? Does he not get that that would mean he'd probably be impeached, instantly? I just don't get it. I don't think he's thought this through. Canada is great in some ways, but on free speech, on socialism versus capitalism, on so many issues, they're not in line with America, and adding them in whatever form that took would skew our politics in not the direction Trump wants. It just doesn't make sense to me that he's continuously saying this and seems to have not thought about the consequences. And again, guys, Canada doesn't want to be part of America. You look at polling and it's like 10% of Canadians say they're interested in becoming a state, so 90% are not. I'm not against the idea of the US adding territory if people want to join America. I think Greenland is the best potential opportunity where there could be a purchase or a deal or an acquisition where people are supportive. But what are we going to do? Invade and take over another country? That would be crazy and kind of evil. Apparently, some Canadians think that's what's going to happen, and according to this one mega viral TikTok, are preparing for war with the United States. Take a listen.
America doesn't know. America doesn't know the same thing that Canada is hearing. I was just on a call with some very, very well-educated people. I mean, people who work in DC, lawyers, writers, very well-educated people. And as of this morning, Saturday, February 8th, I was saying to them, yeah, Canada is preparing for war. And they were like, what are you talking about? They don't know. And so I was on this call and I said, yeah, we're preparing for a war. And they were like, with who? With us, with the US. How do they not know? Guys, you're about to go into war.
So that video was interesting. I don't think that's true. I don't think most Canadians are actually preparing for war, but Trump is causing serious frictions and strain between us and our northern neighbors, and it's clearly having some negative effects. There's also a problem with what Trump said about the economics of our relationship with Canada. He's talking about the fact that we have a trade deficit with Canada, which means that to the tune of several $100 billion a year, we buy more from them than we sell to them. So it's not equally perfect. We don't buy and sell the exact same amount to each other, which would be a $0 trade balance. He says this is a subsidy, but it's not. That's not really correct. It just means that we're sending more money to Canada and getting more goods and products in exchange. That's not a subsidy. That's not us doing Canada a favor. It's us paying for things we want and need and getting them, and Canada getting compensated for it. And a lot of that money actually ends up coming back into the US through foreign investment, just not directly through trade. So I don't subscribe to the belief that trade deficits are a bad thing. But even if you do subscribe to that belief, well, then why would you want to add it as a state? Because that wouldn't make the trade deficit go away. It would just incorporate it into America. But if you think it's harming Americans, then wouldn't that still be true even if they were a state? The whole thing doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And the time-constrained format of the Super Bowl interview did kind of limit Trump's ability to explain it in more depth or be asked follow-up questions, but I hope he doesn't go anywhere with this idea anytime soon. One thing Trump did float during the Super Bowl that I actually think is smart is abolishing the penny. During the Super Bowl, Trump left early. It was that boring. He decided to shake things up and tweet, "For far too long, the United States has minted pennies, which literally cost us more than 2 cents to make. This is so wasteful. I have instructed my Secretary of the U.S. Treasury to stop producing new pennies. Let's rip the waste out of our great nation's budget, even if it's a penny at a time." So this actually makes a lot of sense. Trump is correct. It costs the government more than 2 cents to make a penny, and we make billions of pennies a year. According to the New York Times, last year, the Mint issued over 3 billion pennies, according to its annual report, at a loss of about $85 million. Pennies, which are often given as change but rarely spent, accounted for more than half of all the coins the Mint produced that year. Personally, I can't remember the last time I used a penny in any actual setting, and almost all commerce is done digitally now. Prices could be rounded up or down to the nearest nickel. It seems like common sense to me, and insane that the government is spending multiple cents to create the currency for 1 cent. That said, 85 million or whatever the exact savings may come out to is a big number in one sense. In the grand scheme of the federal budget, it's a tiny decimal point, a rounding error, but every penny counts. And it's good to see Trump looking into some common sense ways to cut government waste and spending. Although I remain pretty skeptical about the idea that they're going to be able to balance the budget or anything like that. I hope I'm wrong. What do you guys think? Do you support getting rid of the penny? Let me know in the comments. All right, guys, that's it for today's episode of the Brad vs. Everyone podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Please do make sure you're subscribed if you aren't yet. We're growing so fast and honestly doing kind of amazing numbers lately. Make sure you rate and review if you're listening on any audio podcast platform, and we'll talk again real soon.